Boards. Boards games, it's what we're talking about. Boards games, I'm not gonna shout. We are starting off this streaming with a little bit of singing, and over there you are looking at a person known as Martin. Martin Wallace is not living in a mess. Martin Wallace has made some games. Martin Wallace is not necessarily the best, because, you know, that would imply that there's only one best person, and I want to kind of imply that everyone can be good, you know what I mean? But Martin Wallace has achieved some fame. Board games, it's what we're talking about. Board games, I'm not going to shout. Hello!
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi. Have you ever seen Hunt for the Wilder People?
The Wilder People? No, I have not.
You've never seen Hunt for the Wilder? You have to watch Hunt for the Wilder People, because that's just
a film.
It's a film. It's a film by the guy, Taika Waititi, the guy who did What We Do in the Shadows, the New Zealand director, who he directed the last Thor.
Okay.
But he did a film called Hunt for the Wilder People, and there's a bit where it's about a kid who gets adopted by a couple of some farmers, and the lady does a song just like that for his birthday. Ricky Baker. It's just like that. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's one of the funniest films ever. It's got the best.
I will write it down right now.
Ever. Yes, Hunt for the Wilder People. I am surprised you've never seen it. It's amazing.
Okay, I'm writing it down, and I will promise to check it out. Now, yes. I am Bez. It is coming up to bedtime for Martin Wallace and some other people in that part of the world. And so this is Bezzy Bedtime Board Game Bladder, and today we are talking about themes. We will potentially also be talking about other things, but we will definitely be talking about that. And again, hello, Xate. It is lovely to see you. Who wonders if you were prepared for the singing? And
yeah, I had a vague idea. Yeah, I watched a couple of ones. Yeah.
Loves Hunt for the Wilder People for Ragnarok. I don't know this.
Yeah, it was Thor Ragnarok. Yeah.
Alan Alton, hello, lovely to see you. And so thank you everyone for joining in. And here's Scott Moore from Birmingham. A lot of people from where you left. I mean, you kind of grew up in the middle of England, then you basically decided that Julia loved, your wife now, loved Australia, so you kind of went there via New Zealand. It's kind of like you're dissing on New Zealanders. It's like you're saying, oh, New Zealand, you are just my stopping point.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, that's what we were doing. Although didn't quite pan out the way we planned it to, because originally, we wanted to come directly to Australia, but we couldn't meet the visa conditions because the older you are, the harder it is. And so June checked out New Zealand and found that it was a lot easier to get into New Zealand. And if you got residency in New Zealand, then you could go and live in Australia. And so we went down that path with a business visa, long-term business visa, it's called. But then they changed the rules because the Australians were getting sick and tired of people using that as a way of sneaking into Australia. So then they changed the rules to say that you have to be a citizen of New Zealand, which takes an awful lot longer. But as it happens, actually, it wasn't a case that we chose to leave New Zealand. We failed to get permanent residency in New Zealand. So we would have had to have left anyway, because the business plan didn't work out the way that I said it would. And then we just got lucky in that, I mean, literally we were on a holiday visa at one point, house sitting for somebody in Raglan. And earlier I'd applied for, this is like a long shot thing, I'd applied for what's called a distinguished talent visa for Australia. And we got in on that, which was great. In fact, actually a lot better than if we'd come in the way we planned, because Kiwis that live in Australia get zero rights. They don't get healthcare. They don't get unemployment. They don't get anything. They're very much treated like second-class citizens by the Australians. So we got lucky, all down to being a game designer. So it wasn't a waste of time, me designing.
And I heard that you got these amazing letters of recommendation from Knizia, from Hasbro, from people saying, hey, actually, this person does it's going to boost your economy or something. I don't know.
Yeah, Rhino's was kind of a grudging one. It's kind of like, because I don't think Rhino, his was more than kids of, he's all right. It was really nice. I had some good, some lovely letters of recommendation from different people. Yeah. Made me feel very good about myself.
And Alan says they let their brothers stay in Australia, so Australians can't be that fussy. To be fair, half of the marriage was already Australian, so that's probably
that helps. That helps. Yeah, that helps. I mean, if you're of a certain age, I mean, if you're young, it's not hard to get into Australia. That's the reality. So if you're in your 20s and you've got a good qualification, it's pretty straightforward to get in. It's just Julia and I were in, what's about 3 years, so we're in our mid-50s, and you get 0 points for your age at that point. So it's a real struggle getting in when you're older, which makes sense because they don't want people coming over and being a burden on the health system. It's just a reality. But as it turns out, it looks like it was a good move because we don't have COVID here. So,
Well, very little COVID compared to the rest of the world.
I mean, there's no cases in Queensland that I know. Well, there might be the odd one or two, but it's been very, very mild here. I mean, we do have we have closed borders with everywhere except Northern Territory, which we went to last month because that was the only border we could cross. So we went to Northern Territory, where you can't go in the water, you can't go in the sea because it's full of box jellyfish, and you can't go in the rivers because they're full of crocodiles. It really is a dangerous place.
Rob Harper asks, did it help that you already have a plan for dealing with ancient evil in Australia? Just in case.
Yes, that has. There's some pretty weird creatures in the outback. These weird things called rednecks that they have over here. I think they came over from America. Pretty scary. It is like that. I mean, when Julia's vegan, which is Queensland is kind of is the Australian version of Texas, and so Brisbane is fine because Brisbane is a cosmopolitan, liberal-minded city. But when you go up north to Townsville or something like that, I do worry about walking into a bar and asking if they've got a vegan menu because I just know somebody's going to punch me. It is just that kind of place. It's just,
And morning, Ian. Lovely to have you join us. I want to kind of ask about Australia and why it's better, although maybe that can wait a moment, because we're not just here to talk about Australia. We're not just here to talk about themes, to be fair. We're also here to talk about other brilliant things. What's a little thing which is brilliant? And history. So you used to be, you've continued studying history throughout your entire life. You, delve into history, and all your games are kind of this fusion of, it feels like you want to simulate something. And I know, like, when I played Sinner's Trail, I can't remember when it was like, that's a really clever thing with, more water going in whenever you bring out more ore. And it's a really elegant way to simulate that increasing difficulty of extracting the ore. And it's not like it ever becomes impossible. It's just that you want to be more efficient each time you go into the mines, which I don't know if that's exactly true, but I imagine that that's a reasonable facsimile of the reality.
Yeah, so that's not history. That's called geology. It's because tin...
It's the history of geology, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a distinction between by definition, history is the study of things that are written down. there has to be language involved. But that's me being picky. But no, the interesting thing about that is that coal mines and tin mines operate on different principles, because coal is laid in strata, whereas tin is formed by volcanic action, which tends to be intrusive. So therefore, you get columns of metal, hence you have to dig down. Whereas, the coal mines, you tend to dig along. So digging along, water isn't such a big issue, whereas digging down, water's an issue. So yeah, but
you're right. I mean, it's so give me a couple of, I mean, when you started, like, why is history a brilliant thing? Just go for it.
Well, it's not necessarily brilliant. I mean, I enjoy studying history. I enjoy reading history. I mean, I wouldn't call myself, I'm certainly not as knowledgeable a lot of the people that I've come across over the years, but I enjoy reading history because it kind of gives you a sense of where we are now. You can't really understand the present without having some knowledge of the past. I mean, I'll give you an example of those, which will probably end up me getting into an awful lot of trouble. But last year, you remember when the Labour Party, before the election, when Corbyn was still in power, they were getting slammed for a lot of anti-Semitism. And I don't know a lot about Jewish history, but I figured I'd go off and just read a little bit more. I mean, I haven't read a massive amount, but just read more, just to get an idea of what their actual history is, because a lot of the issues they have today are based on things that have happened to them in the past. You can't understand the Jewish situation now without an understanding of their history. And I think that without wanting to go into too much detail, that the problem is the history is messy because for Israel, history is political. So because for various reasons, so you can't. Very difficult finding an objective history, because somebody's always got.
Isn't that always the case, though? That everything is kind of rewritten and falsified. I mean, frankly, if we look at how Lizzie McGee, there was a period in time when Lizzie McGee's involvement in Monopoly was, almost erased until people like, hey, wait a minute.
Oh, absolutely. It's just there are some areas that are subject to more interference than others. So there are some bits of history where nobody can be bothered arguing about them. I mean, it's like generally the history technology is mostly accurate, except in certain cases of people stealing ideas from other people, I suppose. But there are other parts, I mean, it's like British history. The history taught in schools is a mockery in that they always seem to teach the bits where we're doing well. They teach Dunkirk and they teach us beating up the Germans. They never seem to do Singapore. I don't think they teach Singapore in British history. And that Singapore in itself tells you everything you need to know about the British, and especially about the class system. What a cock up, what a massive cock up, because you had a bunch of people in charge who didn't know what they were doing. That's so yeah, there are some things which get highlighted, other things get swept under the carpet. I mean, it's interesting now with the Black Lives Matter thing, people becoming aware of how much of our history was rooted in the slave trade that a lot of people may not have been aware of. But, it's a fact, it's, something I was aware of, because having studied the 18th century for struggle of empire, Britain, the whole British economy was based on slavery, just because that's the way of the world then, you needed slaves. because you didn't have machines. So slaves was the way you got things done. I mean, I'm not trying to excuse it, but it was just a fact of life back then.
And so the key thing is that we need to learn from this and learn to do better. Or I should say hello to Cheap Sheep Games and hello to Michael Fox. Scott has mentioned that the history of the Vikings was written by the monks, and that's why there's the common perception of the Vikings as bloodthirsty warriors rather than farmers and craftsmen. And so...
yeah, that's definitely the case. They still raided. The problem thing with the Vikings is the problem is because they lived in an area of land where there wasn't a massive amount of arable land, because it's all valleys, you know, that it did mean that you had a surplus population that if they were going to, you know, do well, they had to leave and go abroad and do stuff, either raiding places, or a lot of them fought as mercenary. I mean, one example, yeah, the Varangian Guard that fought in Constantinople. So, and so, yeah, but it is kind of overdone that they're this bunch of mad, crazy raiders. But I think that's the Hollywood version. And, you know,
yeah, you're going to always accentuate things. I have to simply apologize. This is genuinely the first time this has ever happened. I realize that my plug is in another room, but let's
are we
get
going to have a small commercial break or something? Yeah.
I was just going to block my screen for literally about 1 minute. But
Okay.
Let's talk about recent highlights, living life and seeing the sights, recent highlights, playing games and other delights. So I would like to invite everyone in the comments, but also especially you, Martin, to talk about what's been a big thing that you've enjoyed in the past few weeks.
Game-wise?
Game-wise, life-wise, anything.
Life-wise? Oh, well, definitely recently, life-wise would be Northern Territory. That was definitely very, very interesting. You know, Darwin is an incredible place. And it's, I mean, from a number of aspects, it's I think it's one of the only, well, one of the main places that was bombed in the Second World War. Apparently more bombs were dropped on Darwin than were dropped on Pearl Harbor. But I don't, you know, but the wildlife up there, absolutely incredible. Just being able to drive up to rivers and stand by the river and just see crocodiles sunning themselves on the bank was just amazing. And just how old the scenery is. Australia is a very worn down country. It's just, it feels old. It's just something about it. Whereas New Zealand feels very young. New Zealand is a very young feeling country, but Australia just feels so old. So
it feels like you're enjoying living somewhere where you've got this depth of history that you can tap into, and obviously it's inspired Australia, I guess.
Yeah, Australia I started designing when I was in New Zealand. And it's part of this tendency that of designing games about places I've been to. And a lot of the games I've done in the past have been based on places that, like Tinner's Trail. Tinner's Trail came about because my wife's parents lived in Cornwall, so we went down to Cornwall a lot. Last Train to Wensleydale came about because we went to Wensleydale a lot, because this was back when Julia was a vegetarian and they did her favorite cheese. So we'd go back to Wensleydale to buy more of her favorite cheese. When I went to New Zealand, we moved over to New Zealand. I worked on a game based on New Zealand history. I can't remember the name of it now. Moa. And so, yeah, then I looked at doing a game on Australian history. And very much like Moa, the problem is you can't do you can't do a realistic game on Australian history because nobody would buy it because it's just too brutal. Nasty, horrible history.
I don't know. In these days
and
and ages, don't you think that there is a desire to learn about brutality, and that there are ways of not making it more palatable, but making it so that you don't always play as the aggressor, whether it's I don't know.
To be honest, I think if you're going to teach the history, a more accurate history of Australia, it's probably better done through a documentary. Games can have some educational impact. I'm not sure they make the best vehicles for trying to educate people in what some people might say would be a political manner. I mean, I used to play war games when I was younger, and I think the main thing I learned from them was just geography. I think games with proper maps are great for teaching geography, but that's incidental. But I don't think games are the best way of teaching people, and I don't think people want to be taught by games. People play games because they want to escape from reality. People do not want to play a game because it's going to teach them some rather horrible facts. It's not.
I don't know. Like, I kind of feel like, obviously, I'm biased because you probably aren't aware, but I'm working on a game signed by Inside the Box, which is about discrimination and negotiation and subjugation of power. And it has been abstracted away, so it's about aliens. But I feel like there are games like, Freedom, the Underground Railroads, and where people are attracted to it because of the realism. And yeah, it feels like, so Xate says, if I am playing a game, I am less interested in learning. However, if I have to learn something and can do so through a game, I am excited to do so. And so, to me, it's kind of like, yeah, recently I've not been of a mindset to watch any documentaries, even though there are plenty of documentary films or whatnot, because it's maybe just life is a bit grim. I'm not enjoying myself. I tend to watch comedies currently. And in the same way, I would love there to be games that are both comedies and, yeah, more serious things, which, I mean, it's interesting because obviously there is a lot of realism in your games. There's things that are attempting to simulate or model things that happened, but you come to it very much, it sounds like, from the purpose of, okay, this is going to be an interesting set of mechanisms for people to ponder and engage them and have fun with them, rather than for the purpose of any teaching. Would you agree with that?
I suppose I'm not trying to overtly teach people things. What I'm trying to do, if I can do, is certain things I want to feel like they're true to the history. Occasionally there'll be little nuggets of, or maybe nuggets or bits of history buried in there, but I don't think anybody notices them. I remember years ago, we had this conversation. I got invited to a game event in Italy, Play, I think it was called. Must have been back in 2010 or something. And it was a big event. I mean, a really big event, and there's quite a few guest designers. And because a lot of the attendees did not speak English, we all had our own personal translator, which is great because I had this very nice Italian girl from university who was just there all of the time translating for me. I've never had that before. It was brilliant. And we did have that question come up, which was, because we're doing a forum thing, so we're doing a question answer thing with Grippy People, which was, can games teach you anything? And I used the example of God's Playground. I don't know if you've ever played God's Playground, but it's on Polish history. And I basically said, the Jesuits say, fuck you up. Okay? Because that's one of the things in God's Playground, because the Jesuits fucked Poland. Nobody laughed, so I figured that the translation was quite poor. But, you know, so there is that. But I don't think anybody ever came back to me about God's Playground and said, why did the Jesuits have such a negative impact? And it's like, because they did. I mean, effectively, they turned what was a progressive, forward-looking Protestant country into a backward-looking Catholic country. So I suspect I've just offended a whole load of religious people there. But there we go. You seem to have gone quiet. Have I hit a mute or something?
Nope. A quick hello to, sorry, Jess. Sorry, the comments are coming too fast, so I hit the wrong buttons. But quick hello to Jess. Lovely to have you. And Mike, building off what you said, says a thematic game needs to interpret the subject matter with a degree of accuracy, not necessarily educational, but recognizable. And would you broadly agree with this? Sorry, you've muted yourself, Martin.
Right. Yeah, am I back on? Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. You know, that if you can fit stuff into a game that is true, you know, that is based on fact, if you can get it in the game without screwing the game over, then yes, it should be put into the game. I'll give you another example of this, which is, this is a game that's not been published yet. I've actually just sent it to Roxley. So hopefully they're going to do it. But it's a big civilization game, okay? Kind of based on Anno 1800. And so it goes from 3000 BC to 300 BC. And it's all about developing technologies. And I know that if it comes out, somebody will publish it. Somebody's going to ask the question, why are there two types of horses? Because in the game, you develop, horses are a technology, okay? But there's technologies come in levels. So you have different levels of bronze technology, because developing a technology isn't a case of, oh, we've invented that technology, now we know everything about it. Technologies develop over time. They get better, you know. So so different technologies come in different levels, you know, so there's a higher level of them. And there's two different levels of horses. And I know somebody's going to say, but isn't a horse a horse? It's like, no. Because one of the things I was struggling with the game was back in 3000 BC, the killer weapon system was chariots, okay? If you had chariots, you tended to win battles. You know, you had to have chariots. And then at a certain point, chariots were rubbish. People stopped using them. And you kind of think, well, why was that? And it's one of those things. Why did they stop using chariots? And the main reason is the horses got bigger, because ride them. The horses that pulled chariots, you couldn't ride because they were too small, because horses in the wild are small. And if you leave horses, feral horses will after a while, they become small. It took thousands of years of human intervention of breeding horses to make them big. I mean, literally thousands of years to make that happen. So in 3000 BC, you couldn't ride horses because they were too small. But by 1500 or 1000 BC, they were bigger. And for me, that was an important thing. I could have just put horses in one level, and it's not a big thing, but for me, that was like, yeah, that's showing an aspect of the history of horses that feels to me right. It's probably not a good topic of conversation at the dinner table, but I find that kind of thing interesting.
And Alex says they've seen remains of tiny horses the size of dogs.
Yeah, it's, I mean, we take horses for granted. It's like, you know, there's a reason why, you know, the Mongols and the Tartars and the, you know, the various horse tribes of the steppes were fearsome with, because they were one of the few people who knew how to ride horses. You know, you couldn't simply get a horse and ride it, because you need to years and years and years of training to ride a horse. You need years and years and years of knowing how to look after horses. Horses are actually quite difficult things to look after. And that's one of the other elements in the game. There's actually one of the little cards is Kekuli's horse treaties, which was a manual of how to look after horses, what to feed them. Because you couldn't just simply ship some horses down to Egypt and say, hey, there you go, there's some horses, go off and use them. You had to know how to breed them, how to feed them, how to train them. There's a lot of work that goes into using a horse. I suppose it goes back to the Hollywood version where you just see a cowboy got on the back of a horse and you just assume you do. But no, it's just... But yeah, horses in the wild are small. I mean, you see that in the UK. That the New Forest ponies are small. I think the American Mustang, which because horses aren't natural to America. The Mustang are horses that went feral after Western people brought them over, and they are smaller than your average horse. So for me, that was an important thing to get in there. Certain things I felt are true to history that should be reflected in the game, which I suppose comes back to this thing about theme. And one of the things that annoys me is that I see a lot of so-called thematic games out there, and I think, those aren't thematic at all.
And I presume your Civilization game has spectacles in it.
No, that's the second part. Spectacles weren't a thing until Middle Ages.
Oh, so your Civilization game stops before then?
It goes from 3000 BC to 300 BC, and then the plan is to do another that will go from about 600 AD probably up to 1900. Basically, I just want to skip the Roman period because it's really difficult to model the Roman Empire.
Okay. Well, that definitely sounds interesting. I think that I'm going to see how, just to warn people, I have been warned by Martin that we are going to have to finish after an hour-ish. So,
well, I'm quite happy to keep going if you need. We'll just see where we go.
So let's move to the questionably quick questions. So let's start off with the easy ones. What is your name?
Martin.
What's your full name?
Martin Wallace.
I believe that to be true.
Yeah.
Where exactly are you and what time is it?
I am in Mapleton, Sunshine Coast, Queensland, and it is 7:33 in the evening.
Would you rather have a duck-sized meeple or a meeple-sized duck?
A duck-sized meeple or a meeple-sized duck? Wow, that's a really tiny duck. I should probably go for the meeple-sized duck because Julia likes ducks. We're looking at buying a house because when we were in New Zealand, we had chickens and we had ducks. So probably a meeple-sized duck, although we have 4 cats, so it probably lasts about 5 minutes. A duck-sized meeple, I don't know what you would do with that.
We've got a few questions. Someone asked about the Australia expansion and how that's going.
It's going very well, mostly because Mandy's on the job, which is good because she's a lot more on the ball than I am. But yeah, it's interesting. It kind of started originally because Mandy, that's Amanda Milne from Shill Mill. Yeah, she started doing the expansion thing, showed it to me. I looked at it, thought, yeah, there's bits of this work, bits don't. So I thought, okay, let's see how we can make that work. And that one thing led to another thing. And then it ended up being there's basically a deck of cards that you add that allow a 5th player. So you have somebody who can play the old ones. And the old one player has this deck of cards and they can draw various minor old ones. So it turned out to be a really nice way of introducing a whole lot of extra Cthulhu stuff, but in a relatively simple way. Of course, when we were planning to do this, we hadn't looked into the future and noticed that 2020 had been booked for COVID, and it's just really not a good time to be putting out a 5th player expansion. So now we're pivoting to try and make it solo as possible. you know, I kind of figure if we can make it played by 0 players, then we'll sell a ton. We'll just, you know. So yeah, then we add the Tasmania map, because Stronghold, who kind of the American thinks that, yeah, we just need more stuff in the box. So yeah, we knocked together a Tasmania map, which works nicely as a lower player count. So yeah, it's going well. It's going well.
We've got a question about regrets. So do you have regrets? Do you think that there's a parts of your, or actually sorry, I misinterpreted this. This is about when people talk about you in the future. If people were to talk about you, do you think that people would get parts of your life wrong?
I don't think anybody would be interested in my life. I think this is bizarre. You know, there's this weird thing where because somebody does something, for some reason that makes them an interesting person. You know, I'm happy for people to play my games. And if people are playing my games in even 10 years' time, that's great. That's wonderful. But I don't know why anybody would be interested in my personal life, because on a day-to-day basis, it's really dull. I mean, just really dull. Sorry.
Isn't there this, sorry, I should like let you blather, I'm really sorry, but it feels like there's this whole, we're interested to know what kind of mind came up with this mechanism, what kind of mind made all these games, because you have been incredibly prolific, you have reached so many people, and so there's a desire to know more about the person behind the games.
Yeah, but the thing is, just because I design a game, it doesn't mean I know how I do it. It's a very difficult process to analyze. And I think you would find that with anybody who is creative in any way, you know, anybody who writes books or produces music, it doesn't come from a purely analytical process of let's do A, then B, then C. This is why it's very hard to teach creativity. You know, you can teach skills, you can teach somebody to make certain chemicals, or you can teach somebody to shape wood, but you know, it's very difficult to teach somebody to write. I personally think it's impossible. And so it's not really a process that is amenable to analysis. And so I don't know what you would find out. I mean, all I know is that with years and years and years of working on game design, I've probably reshaped my brain so that it's very good at solving a particular set of problems. But ask me to fold a towel and not a chance. Making beds, no. You know, a lot of basic stuff, not a chance. But, you know, but for some reason, I can design games because a lot of it involves keeping, I don't know, it's a kind of an internal spatial thing where you're trying to model things in your head. And that's just something over the years that I've developed a knack of being able to do, in the sense that part of the game design process is effectively designing pretty much the whole game in your head before you even put it down on paper, and playtesting it in your head, which I know sounds weird, but that's what you have to do so that you avoid putting stuff down on paper that doesn't work. But yeah, externally, it's not an interesting process. I mean, I've been working on a new game design, started a couple of weeks ago, and the process normally involves me playing solitaire, because I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. So I just sit on my computer and I'll play solitaire. And after a couple of hours, I feel really guilty because I've done nothing, absolutely nothing. And then I might have a lie down or something like that, and I go back and think, oh, I'll start working now, but I'll just have another game of solitaire. And that's, you know, some working days, that's all that happens. And then there'll be this burst of activity where in a very short period of time, it's like, boom, oh, yeah, now I've done something. Because a lot of it, I mean, one of the nice things about doing this full time is I have the advantage of being able to spend a lot of time thinking about problems without there being a lot of other stuff going on. You know, I don't have a day job to worry about. I don't have kids to look after. There aren't, you know, we don't have a social life at the moment because we're too far away from anywhere. So, you know, it gives me a lot of time to think on these problems. And that's where most of my work goes on. It goes on inside my head. I get most of my best work comes from going and walking. Walking is an incredible aid to thinking. And very often.
Would you say that for you, the most valuable playtesting is that kind of simulation inside your head rather than actually sitting down with other people?
It's 50-50, because just because it works in your head doesn't mean it works in practice. And there's always things you're not going to take into account. But it's a 50-50. So it's like Anno 1800. I worked that out of my head, put it down on paper. It worked first time. It wasn't perfect. It needed polishing. But the first playtest we actually played to the end of the game. Because I knew I was using mechanisms that were relatively robust. There were a few edge cases. There's some parts of the economy that didn't quite work, but they could be tweaked. But the core mechanism was all there right from the beginning. I've had a number of cases where I've got to the point now where, yeah, the first version of a game will work. It's just will need polishing. Which just saves an awful lot of time.
I mean, thank you for sharing this. And I think that even if our brains aren't quite, you know, the same as the Martin Wallace brain, you know, it does give an insight of, I think, because he talks about why is this interesting, and I think it's because, you know, just hearing about the creation is interesting, and that's why we've got a phenomenal number of questions, which I'll just get to half of them. I'm not going to be able to pick every single one, so apologies to everyone. Trav asks, would you move back to anywhere you've previously lived? If this is your favorite place, why is Australia best?
Me personally, I really like New Zealand. New Zealand is just gorgeous. When we first moved there, it's like, wow, I've died and I've gone to heaven. It is just the most amazing place. The scenery is gorgeous. The people are beautiful. The Kiwis are some of the most genuinely nice people you ever meet. I mean, as a country, it is just a really nice country. Julia doesn't like the cold. That's why I had to move to Australia, because Australia is warmer. So I think part of me would like to go back to New Zealand. The biggest issue I've had, and this is the thing that why this is, I mean, everybody knows this is a crap year. See, it was okay before 2020 because I go back to the UK twice a year and then I could fill up on beer, because that's the one thing I miss. There is no country in the world that does British beer. I mean, just nowhere. You have to be in Britain for the beer and the pies. The pies are pretty good as well, but mostly the beer. And so I'm missing my beer. I'm definitely missing my, and pubs. I mean, I know beer and pubs are kind of go to, but the British pub is just such an amazing thing, because Australian pubs are scary. I mean, basically they're urinals. I mean, they're designed so you can clean up the blood easily. And they are just so unwelcoming. They're just horrible, tiled, brightly lit places with TVs on the wall. I mean, they're just nasty. They're just, I don't know why people go in them. You know, they're not, whereas your British pub where you can just kind of sit in a corner on a nice comfy chair and, you know, there's a log fire going and it just feels comfy. You feel safe and enveloped in this wonderful, warm sensation. So yeah, I miss British pubs. But I'm not sure if I'd move back to the UK. It's been interesting seeing different cultures and different.
So really what you want is a crate of British beer kind of sent over to you.
It doesn't work that way. I mean, there is a pub down near the Gold Coast, which is a British pub. And it's got all the paraphernalia. It's weird. It's kind of got a London bus outside. so on. And they do British beer, except it's the crap sort, Bass, and this, the stuff that we had in the 70s. But the thing is, in Australia, you have to serve beer below a certain temperature. It doesn't matter where it comes from. So it has to be served at a lower temperature than it would be normally served. And the thing with British beer is it's brewed to be served at room temperature or cellar temperature. You reduce, you lower the temperature and you kill the taste. I mean, this is why American beers and Australian beers tend to be over hopped, because they're served at a cooler temperature. They basically have to ram a whole load more hops in them just so you can taste anything. There you go. See, British pubs are the best. Yeah.
And we've got other people who love the cold and want to go to Finland, but clearly not the opposite to Julia. Got some questions about Kickstarter. You've talked about how Kickstarter is ruining things to some degrees. Maybe I'm misrepresenting what you said. Obviously, you are free to reiterate what you actually meant. But
yeah, I retain the right to change my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of said that it led to too many games, and it led to a lot of underdeveloped games.
Those two things are absolutely true. There are too many games on the market. And yeah, there are some games, some very well-known games, very highly rated games, which I think are undeveloped or could do with additional development. I think now it's just the way it is. There's no point in moaning about it. It's just Kickstarter it's here. It's not going anywhere.
And so you're planning to use it for Bloodstones?
Yes, yeah. And this is the interesting thing, in that Kickstarter has changed the economics of game production. So yeah, one example would be Bloodstones, which Bloodstones it's a game that uses kind of domino style tiles. So the production costs are really high. And if you were doing this as a retail game, you couldn't do it, because the retail price would be, well, in US dollars, the retail price would be somewhere around about $200. So you'd be looking, what, £150? And you wouldn't pay that for this game. It would just be too much. But with Bloodstones, what we're planning to do is we're only going to sell it direct to the public via Kickstarter. And there might be some sold directly from a couple of websites. I've not fully worked that out yet. But most of the copies will be sold via Kickstarter. Hence, we can keep the price down to something that's reasonable. So rather than selling for $200, the price I'm aiming at is $80, which is a lot more reasonable. Now, you couldn't have done that 10 years.
That's Australian dollars, right?
That's US dollars.
US dollars, sorry.
Because it's being produced in China, and China quotes in US dollars. So 79 US dollars, it's probably about 100 Australian dollars, but Australia is not a massive market anyway. But suddenly, so without Kickstarter, I couldn't do Bloodstones, because you wouldn't be able to potentially sell that number direct to the public, because normally the avenues are not there. But Kickstarter has changed that. So yes, that's one positive. The second thing is, which kind of ties in that, is that now when you design a game, when you are designing a game, you have to bear in mind the final cost of production. You can't just design whatever you want to do. You have to bear in mind that the thing has to be printed and that there are costs involved with that. But now, because you've got Kickstarter, you can put a lot more stuff in. So, for instance, the game I've just started working on, it's a game I'm doing with Mandy for Shilmore, which I had done a version a couple of years ago. It's called Monster Rock. So it's a mashup of Dungeons and Dragons and 60s rock music. And it's going to have a ton of cards in it, because it's going to be a deck building game, and it's going to have loads of cards in it. And again, 10 years ago, you just couldn't have done that number of cards, because cards are relatively expensive to produce, or they used to be. I mean, that the price costs have come down now. And also the amount of artwork would just not have been doable. But suddenly now you can do that because you know that you're going to sell a significant number direct on Kickstarter, and that will cover a lot of your base production and mostly artwork costs. So it's changed. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. There's some negatives in it, but there are also some positives. And it is just where we are now.
What's about you as a consumer? Do you personally back? Are you backing anything on Kickstarter?
I've never backed a Kickstarter in my life. I wouldn't know how to do it. No.
So who's actually running the Kickstarter for you then?
It's going to be a team of people. So I've got a friend of mine, Stephen, in Brisbane, who's going to be doing some of the working on the website, and he's going to be working on a version of the game for Board Game Arena. I'm talking to a lady called Jess in America who's really up on social media and marketing. So she's going to put that together. David Tertzi's working on a solo mode. So he's because you can never shut David up. So he's always chipping in with bits of advice. So he's going to help. It's going to be a team effort. So me kind of in the background. And then, when the thing goes live, there are people that helped with the Australia Kickstarter, people like Stuart Pilling and Colby Reddish, people around the globe. So that, because I know that one of the key things is when you go live with a Kickstarter, people want their questions answered before they ask them. So having people there ready to respond immediately before somebody starts dissing you, it's like, yeah, I understand that's a key part of the process. It is communication. So yeah, there's enough people involved to stop me screwing it up, I think.
And it must be pretty reassuring to know that you've reached this point in your career where you can legitimately print a few thousand copies and get them direct to consumers.
Yeah. Well, hopefully so. I mean, it doesn't. The thing is, it's interesting when you assume that your name will increase your sales. It doesn't always work that way. I mean, there's a number of games with my name on that have bombed over the years, quite a lot actually. So it doesn't have the impact that people think it does. It really doesn't. First and foremost, for some people, I suppose the problem is there are a lot of people who expect a certain type of game from me. And when they get that, they're happy. I think, this kind of the old Warfrog kind of either economic game like Brass or Age of Steam, or the kind of war gamery stuff, the heavier stuff. A lot of people expect that kind of stuff from me. So whenever I've done the lighter stuff, they kind of go, what's this? This is just confusing us now. So yeah, it's a combination of, my name helps in that people might take a look at it, but if what they look at that doesn't interest them, they will still walk on by.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know you've done the 5 Games for Doomsday podcast, so would you just direct people to that one to hear the last 2 minutes to pick your top game, where you pick which one, or has it changed over the year?
I can't even remember which. I can't even remember what I said now. No, it's probably the same. I don't know. I haven't played a lot of commercial games recently because I'm stuck up in Mapleton. I'm an hour and a half away from Brisbane, and so it's been difficult to meet up with people. So yeah, but nothing's really changed. Not played anything. I did go to a games convention in July. I played a couple of new games, but I didn't think much of them. This tends to be the way. Whenever I play a lot of the new games that come out, I get to play them and I go, yeah, I didn't really care for that. I think I'm a very picky games player. I think it's part of the thing of being a game designer. I know somebody.
So I know you picked Bluff in that show. I don't know. Have you played Lie, which is the tiny micro game, which is the size of a pack of cards? It's one of the Paco games by Chris Handy, and then instead of rolling dice, you get random cards. But then the one decision point that it adds is each card is this number or that number. And at first I thought, okay, this is just a rip-off of Bluff. But when or where Perudo or whatever you want to call it. But when you actually play it, it's like actually that one extra decision does add something. So what might be something that you want to consider. But yeah, it seems like you are someone who enjoys the sort of 90-minute, 2-hour medium weight Euro game, but with a fair bit of simplicity. Like, do you think that your taste reflects what you design?
It's certainly a case, I think, that I try and design games that I enjoy playing. I mean, yeah, I think in the other one, you know, I really enjoy Terra Mystica. I like Terra Mystica. For me, that's got a lot of the things that I enjoy in the game. You know, it's low luck, a lot of strategy, and enough complexity for there to be different strategies. So I enjoy that. But as I say, a lot of the games that are coming out at the moment that people seem to like, they kind of leave me cold. I'll give you an example. It's like, and I know I'm probably getting into trouble for this. I played On Mars, the Vital Lacerda game. And I played a couple of his, and I just find them too complicated. They just confuse the hell out of me. And by the end of the game, I still got no idea what I'm doing. I kind of thinking, well, I'm not that stupid. I must, you know, I've got a reasonable idea how games work. And I think, is it me or is it the games? And a lot of the German style games, I'm really going cold on that because they're just too abstract. It's just too much about, yeah, do this and get so many points, or do that and get a few more points. And which goes back to the thing about theme. You know, they might say they have a theme, but they don't really. They got nothing to do with the theme. It's like Great Western Trail. I don't think, you know, it purports to be about cattle drives in the American South, but it's got nothing to do with it. I don't think there's any history in the game at all. So as I say, I do find most games leave me cold. It's weird. I'm trying to think of games that I have played that I've kind of enjoyed, and I'm struggling. Yeah. I quite enjoyed Estates, that bidding game, the one where you're building tower blocks. That was okay. But I don't know. I think that's kind of the thing, going back to the theme thing. It's just, if you're going to do a game on a theme, you should be trying to reflect that theme, you know. And I think some people's perception or definition of the word varies from mine, because I see people saying, "Oh, this game's really thematic," and they'll say it's thematic because it's got pictures of the theme in it. But I always think a thematic game is a game where, are you making decisions in the game that somebody who, if they were really in that situation, would be making the same decisions? That to me is thematic. It's not a case of, oh, just because you've got some thematic text or because you've got some fancy artwork. That doesn't make a theme. What you want to be doing is in the game facing the same kind of challenges, the same issues, and that somebody, if it's based on a historical situation, would face in reality.
And I think this ties into a really nice definition. So I know that Shem Phillips has talked a lot about the division between setting and immersion. And I know that if you look at a literary theme, it's not even any of those. It's some sorts of central idea or message, which you could argue, frankly, from a literary point of view, what's the theme in Tinner's Trail or Der Weiße Lotus? Like, because, and yeah, so you feel like it's all about the immersion, that the decisions that a player is making match the decisions that would be made by someone in that situation?
That, yes. And I mean, Der Weiße Lotus is not a good example because that was actually based, the Germans put a theme on that because the original theme was Norman Sicily. But that's a long time ago. But yeah,
20 years ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. I mean, say an example I think I've given a couple of times. Struggle of Empires. In Struggle of Empires, one of the key decisions you have to make is who you're going to ally with. You know, most of the game is who I'm going to fight, who am I going to ally with? And that's based on the fact that the advice given by Frederick the Great's father to him was basically, on his deathbed, whatever, the main piece of advice to him was like, never attack Austria unless you've got an alliance with Russia, and never attack Russia unless you've got an alliance with Austria. So in 18th century warfare, it was all about alliances. Who do I ally with? It wasn't about, weapon systems obviously play a part, but a large part of it was who do you ally with? And the game puts you in that situation. There's no, the rules themselves are relatively simple. It's like, who does it make sense for me to ally with in this situation? I think of other examples.
I mean, do you think that diplomacy is a thematic game?
No, not in the same way, because the thing about Struggle of Empires is you have to be on one side or the other. Because historically, whenever you look at any periods of warfare, generally countries split into two sides, Axis and Allies. In the First World War, you had two sides. In the Second World War, you had two alliances. So it doesn't tend to be each country looking after itself. In diplomacy, you can switch very quickly. That there's no formal sides as such. Whereas in Struggle of Empires, for the period of a war, you are in an alliance and you can't attack your allies. So it's a hard and fast alliance. It's not one where you can stab them in the back. And it's the fact that you are splitting into two sides, for me, which makes it more historically realistic. You never have periods of, trying to think, I can't really think of any periods of history where you have three different combatants operating at the same time. It does always tend to be one versus one.
So it sounds like for you, for something to be thematic, it's kind of a simulation in some sense, that there has to be some direct analog, and you have to be thinking, okay, if there was this aspect, then we should have that core aspect that drives our decisions. That it should be, sure, you can abstract things away, but would you say that you're looking from the simulationist point of view?
I'm not exactly sure. No, simulations are something very different. So games by definition are abstract. They're not simulations in a meaningful sense. But what you're trying to do is create an abstraction which somehow reflects certain realities. Just to plug Bloodstones again, you see, for me, one of the things, Bloodstones has got a generic fantasy theme, which is probably its biggest drawback. But it's a war game, and it's a war game. It's with different fantasy sides, and it's asymmetrical warfare thing. But one of the things I like about it is, without it having a complex set of rules, it embodies a number of principles that are general to warfare, in that you have to have a main attack force. If you don't have a single strong main attack force, you're going nowhere. You have to have a retreat path. There are no complicated retreat rules, but if you don't have a retreat path, you're in an awful lot of trouble. You've got to be careful about operating too far away from your own home territory, because supply becomes an issue. Now, there are no supply rules in the game. It's just you can only build new units where you have your villages. So if you're too far away from your villages, so if you're deep in enemy territory, it's very difficult for you to feed reinforcements in. And then you're at danger of being surrounded and then being destroyed. So the rules themselves are very simple, but there are general principles that you can apply, that real generals would apply to a military situation. You can apply that to the game, and they will work in your favor. That if you apply those principles, it should guide your behavior so that you make better decisions. Now, for me, that's not so much a simulation, but that for me is pleasing, because it means those principles, those general principles, are emerging from a simple set of rules. And the thing with game design is emergent behavior, which is the most pleasing thing. If you've got things that emerge from a simple set of rules that are not explicit, but they're just in there, then that is a wonderful thing. Very hard to do, but that if you can do it, that for me is what makes a game interesting.
I mean, lots of your games have some tie into reality, whether it's war, or like kind of the rise of industry, or delivering cheese around, and which that one was a bit odd when I played it.
So which one's that?
Wensleydale.
Oh, yeah. That was a struggle, because that was, how do you design a train game in an area of land where they built very few trains, because it's so hilly? That was a challenge. So the delivering milk was a bit of a funny one, because really they were using trains for other things. But I suppose they did deliver milk, yeah. But yeah.
But like when you went to crazy themes like Moonga and now Australia and whatnot, but Hit Zero Roads, when you're going into the realms of science fiction, horror, zombies, whatever, it sounds like, what makes a game thematic? I would like to ask you what. Yeah.
So that's interesting. It's like one of the reasons why sometimes I go into fantasy is because it's a lot easier dealing things in a fantasy environment than a historical environment. I mean, this is very much why, going back to Australia, why it's got Cthulhu in it, because you're still dealing with the same issues you have of colonizing Australia, which is, it's a big place, you need railways, you've got to go and mine stuff. But now, instead of killing the indigenous tribes people, you get to kill monsters, and people are much happier killing monsters than killing indigenous tribes people. So you can have some of the history there, and then you can hide other bits of the history within a fantasy element. But I think it's also, I mean, this is one of the things I took from reading a lot of Terry Pratchett when I was doing the Discworld games, in that certainly with Terry's later books, he would put he would couch social issues in a fantasy world. And you can see in the later ones, that he would deal with aspects of racism, sexism, stuff like that. But he would do it with fantasy characters. I mean, I don't know if you've read any of his stuff or not. I don't know if that.
Barely any, unfortunately.
Okay. And it's interesting because it's like, as I say, I mentioned, it's like, so just because something's fantasy doesn't mean it can't be realistic, in a sense. So it's like, I mentioned the Monster Rock game I'm doing. I first designed that because Mandy had an idea. She wanted to do a game about the music industry. And I said, music games are death. Nobody's ever done a good game about music, because it's just a really hard thing to do. So I shot it down. And then I came back and thought, but what if you had it in a fantasy setting, so that you could kind of go off at different angles? You don't have to deal with the realism of the music industry. You can now start doing other things. So I knocked together something pretty quickly, which was kind of a fantasy board game where you're going around, you've got your band, and instead of killing things, you're having to survive audiences. So you're playing different audiences, like you'll be playing the elves or the undead or orcs or whatnot, and they all like different types of music, and you've got to play them the music that they like. And we did that, and it kind of worked, but we never found a home for it. Well, Colossal were going to do it, and then things fell apart at Colossal. And And then recently I thought, I should go back to this because there's something good in there. But I thought, I'm always telling wannabe game designers, say, you have to do your reading. And I never did any reading for that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to try again. I'm going to design it from the base up. But this time, I'm going to do my reading. And I have been reading so much stuff on rock bands. I've been reading about the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, the Beatles, Crosby, Stills, Nash, all these lots of books. I've been reading about Lemmy, had the history of heavy metal and so on. It's been a real weird thing, having studied really dull books about the 13th century. Most of the stuff I'm reading now is about taking drugs and having sex. But the interesting thing is that gave me so many ideas for the game, because the one thing I hadn't noticed is that the first game was very much, you're just trying to get your record sales up. But the thing in the 60s, because it's basically an alternate 1960s, okay? The thing is, in the 1960s, music was revolutionary. Now, I wasn't really old enough to appreciate that then, but 68, you had the Paris riots, you had a lot of bad stuff going down in America, and a lot of musicians were high up on the FBI's hit lists. That if things go to shit, there were a whole lot of musicians who were going to be locked up. Jimi Hendrix being at the top of the list because he was black. But the thing is, there was a degree of truth in it, in that John Lennon was funding terrorist organizations. Okay? He was giving money to people who were making bombs to overthrow the powers that be. Now, given that the powers that be were Richard Nixon, I have a degree of sympathy with him, because the guy was a massive dick. Richard said that. Anyway, and I kind of think, so now I thought, this is great, because now, rather than the game being about just playing to audiences and just seeing how many record sales you can get, it's now going to be a legacy game in 3 parts, where you start off getting your followers, but the eventual aim is to have a revolution and overthrow the powers that be. So now there's a storyline. Okay. And that wouldn't have come about without doing the reading.
I mean, it sounds like you're talking about having some real depth there, where you really, that reading leads to some bigger ideas for your story. And
well, it creates an overarching story which is rooted in a degree of reality, but it's also putting it in a fantasy world. If you did a realistic simulation of the 60s rock scene, it is mostly men. It is all men. The only reason women are there is for casual sex, with 1 or 2 exceptions. But it's a very male-dominated world. It's a very un-PC world. It really is, in some respects, it's a very distasteful world. Whereas with this, you can rewrite history, and you can say, right, we don't have to, these various band members, historically, 99% of the band members should be men. But this is fantasy now. So we can have a 50-50 split with the sexes. We don't have to make it so male orientated. We can also take into account, so we can take into account a lot of the things that we have now, and kind of retrofit it into a 60s setting, because the gaming audience is changing. And I think you have to recognize that people want to play games where they recognize elements that are familiar to them. And this is a way of doing that, that you can have different characters of different sexualities, different persuasions, different dress styles, where it isn't a monolithic male-centered world. And that kind of interests me, because part of the challenge of designing a game is trying to make a game that people can relate to. An example of that would be Australia, in that you have all of these character cards. Now, they could all have been machines. They could have all been objects that give you benefits. I kind of figure people relate to the concept of other people better than they relate to objects. So if you have a person that does a certain thing, somebody's going to relate to that better than having this box that gives you this particular benefit. And so, yeah, so this game is going to be very much about, lots of different characters that do different things that you can relate to, and that combine, hopefully, to tell an interesting story.
And it seems like you need to have that internal logic. I mean, I assume you're familiar with the Matrix trilogy. One thing that really annoyed me about the sequel was that at the end of the first film, it felt like the whole point was that now Neo is literally able to do anything. That's the point, that they can do anything. And then it gets to the sequel and say, wait a minute, so they actually have limitations to their power, and you need to kind of retrofit that to make the other two films make some sorts of sense. And don't get me wrong, like, if you look at the sequels as just, okay, it's an action film, then it's perfectly good. But what I'm hearing is that you need to have this internal logic, and basing that logic on real world logic, basing that logic on the actual history. It feels like tying into our first brilliant thing, that history of music, that history of whatever is for you the first step to make a properly, as you see it, thematic game.
Well, it's the things being intuitive, and this is going back to there's some games that come out where it's almost like you're having to learn a programming language, and I think this maybe partly explains their appeal to some people who might be into programming languages. But you have to learn this whole set of rules which don't seem to connect with the outside world. But if you internalize those set of rules, you'll do well, because you'll be able to see how you can milk the system for so many points. But they're not intuitive. Whereas I'd much rather design a game that is intuitive, in that, this thing here, whatever it may be, in this game it does this, because in the real world it does that. That there isn't a disconnect, that. So and I think, again, people, because one of the biggest challenges when you're designing a game is trying to the biggest barrier is people learning the game. This is quite difficult. You've been through this. I hate reading rules. Most people hate reading rules. I mean, I know there's some really oddballs out there who love reading rules. Most people hate reading rules. It's a drag, and because you've got no idea at the beginning what the game's going to be like. And so if you can make things intuitive, you're going some way to overcoming that thing where you're not confusing people because things don't make sense. And I think it also helps. I mean, I think that these overly complex games, you spend ages learning them, and then if you don't play them again regularly, in 6 months' time, you've forgotten the rules completely. And at that point, you go, I can't be bothered, And then it just sits on the shelf gathering dust. Where there's other games where the rules, you've internalized, or they're more intuitive, and it's like then you can go back to them because they're easy to pick up again. Generally, at the moment, the kind of games I'm doing, they might not be simple, in terms of gameplay, but I'm trying to make them as much as possible simple in terms of rules. Another example would be Anno 1800, which has just come out from Kosmos. So I'm just going to plug that now, because this is kind of one of the things I do. But the central rules in that are really simple, and it would take me a couple of minutes to explain the game to you. But the choices you have in it are overwhelming. And I still can't play the game well. I still struggle playing the game, and I designed it, and I played it more times than anybody else, and I still get beaten regularly at it because I'm not struggling with the rules, because the rules are simple. I'm struggling with the fact that I don't know the best strategy.
I mean, Go epitomizes this. Would you not agree?
Yes, absolutely. Because very simple rules where you have a complex situation. And that is the ideal. A game that is where the complexity is built into the rules has got it wrong. The rules should always be the minimum number of rules you require to get the job done. All the complexity should be in the situation, not the rules.
And I mean, there's an interesting dichotomy here between being thematic and having a certain number of rules, because, you know, in Magic the Gathering, if you had, okay, this knight has +1/+1 against dragons. Well, unless you actually have that many dragons in the set, you know, probably it's what they call trinket text, like it's not actually going to come up in the game. And what's the point in that? It's stupid. And I know, look, there's a case for lookup tables, and okay, this weapon does this much damage, and this, and you yourself came from a school of 60-page rule books with war games, and then turned it into having that theme, let's say, and for Euro games. And it feels like an easy way to say, okay, this represents more of the reality, is to add more nuance, add more rules to it. But it seems like, I mean, if we look at Plants versus Zombies, okay, that's completely fantastical, but the plants, you put them in the ground, they don't move. The zombies are very slow moving, so that tells you instantly this is what's going to happen. And you know that you're against the zombies. Yeah, if you play a game where you are the zombie, it's a subversion of the trope. I mean, I don't. Are there any board games where you're a zombie? I don't know. There probably is, but I can't think of any. But anyway, the point is that like, you've got to have, what I'm hearing is you've got to hit those pertinent notes. You've got to strip away all those details, and then you've got to say not only what are the details, but what are the key things that matter, and make sure that you hit those things.
But I think, yes, I mean, you're right. And I think you mentioned in Shem before about the immersion thing. I mean, when you're designing a game, if you're having to go and look in a rule book, you're breaking immersion. As much as possible, you want somebody to play the game and be up to speed as quickly as possible, so they're not having to go and look in a rule book, because at that point, boom, you kind of lost them. So this is a trick I did in Australia. I don't know if you played Australia or not, but the combat system in that, I wanted there to be a combat system where different units had different abilities, but I didn't want there to be combat tables. I didn't want there to be a chart that you look at. So you have a deck of cards, and you flip a card, and you cross-reference what you're trying to fight with what you've got there, and that tells you if you hit or not. And you just keep flipping cards until one side dies. But what it meant is, within that deck of cards, I could, by the spread of the symbols, I could make certain units better against other types of creatures than it would be normally. So basically, in the game, things like infantry and armored cars are very good against small things. So they're very good against zombies and stuff like that. But they're not so good against the big stuff, whereas the artillery and stuff is better against the big stuff, but not so good against the zombies. Okay. Now, you don't, in a war game, you would have a chart telling you that. You'd have to look at the chart, and it would, but in this, all of that's embedded in a deck of cards that you don't need to know. You just flip the cards. And it's kind of one of the skills of designing a game, is where you're trying to put stuff under the hood, where you're trying to put it in the game without people worrying about it, without people having to know it. It's just in the game, and it will crop up as and when it's needed to simulate that part of the game. But people don't need to know it beforehand, and people don't have to do a lot of work to understand that, but it's still in there. And, you know, and again, I mean, that again is one of the skills of game designing, is how you can hide stuff out of the way in a game, so it doesn't confuse people, but you still have that degree of complexity or richness there. But
for sure, having information on cards is such a big affordance. And when you look at your early games where it was just using wood, when it was, you know, early, I say early, but, you know, it was once you were already fairly established, but you were creating all these games with wood, and then you decided to not use cards, which I still don't quite understand why cards are supposedly more expensive.
Well, the thing with the Treefrog line is they were short run games, so it's 1,500 games in each one, and the economics of printing are printed material, it starts expensive, and the longer you keep printing, the cheaper it gets. Wood is constant. Wood is adding an awful lot to your upfront, to your initial costs, because you have to set up the printer. That's where most of the costs in printing is. It's not in actually printing it, it's setting up the printer. So it's not a case that cards in themselves are expensive. If you're doing 10,000 cards, they're as cheap as chips. If you're doing 1,000 cards or 50, they're actually quite expensive.
I mean, I wonder if things have changed in the intervening 17 years, because like nowadays, I'm actually even considering doing, okay, let's do a 500 unit print run of just a small tuck box, because for me, the reason why In a Bind was now known as Yogi was originally just a deck of cards was me thinking, what is the cheapest possible thing I can make that I stand a chance of funding on Kickstarter? And then to get that thing, okay, a deck of cards, that's the cheapest possible thing I can do.
A deck of cards on its own is fine. It's just when you combine it with other things. And because you've got a board, you've got a box, that's got to be printed. You've got a board, that's got to be printed. You've got a rule book, that's got to be printed. And you need components. And it's not the cards in themselves, it's everything else. So you add to it, and you're just tipping yourself over the edge. Now, yeah, I would agree that technology has changed such that shorter runs are now more viable. So it wasn't the case when I started Treefrog that was the case, because I was basically printing in Germany. Well, I was printing in Germany. I didn't want to print in China because I had a relationship with the German manufacturers, and it was just easier for me to print in Germany. So doing shorter runs would have been less economically viable. But you see, even with the artwork, you look at the artwork for the Treefrog games and design, because the actual central artwork on the cover of the box is smaller with a big border, which was to save money. I mean, wherever we could save money, we saved money. It was done purely to reduce production costs. And it was an interesting design challenge about how you could design games that still felt thematic, that felt they had depth, without the ability to use cards, because cards are a wonderful mechanism for adding all sorts of stuff. Cards are just great, and not being able to use cards is really difficult, actually. I know there's one of my playtesters who reckoned it would be impossible to design a decent economic game without cards, and then he saw Tinner's Trail and went, oh, okay, so maybe it's doable. Because effectively with wooden pieces, you've got almost zero hidden information. I mean, I think the only game where you have got some hidden information is Automobile, where some of the wooden pieces have got numbers printed on them.
And that's maybe down to the chaos of the players. And even though it's a relatively... Look, it's not simple for a non-gamer. These are games designed for people who have played games, but there is enough emergence complexity. I mean, for goodness sake, let's look at Go, where no one can look until the end of the game. For goodness sake, even a computer can't do it properly. I mean, but yeah, I want to ask you a question from, I think it was, who said, is there a theme that you would not want to do?
There are certain themes I wouldn't touch, which is basically more recent history. So I wouldn't do anything on the Vietnam War. I wouldn't do anything on Afghanistan. Basically, I wouldn't want to touch themes where there are people still living today who were part of that conflict. I'm even getting a bit iffy about World War II. So themes that I wouldn't do. I mean, I think I kind of actually mentioned that with talking about Australia and New Zealand. It's very difficult doing histories where you're dealing with other people's cultures, because it's very difficult to do proper justice to that culture. And because now there's this sense of people owning their culture to a degree, you have to say, right, okay, that is your culture. I'm going to respect your culture by not getting involved with that, or not trying to reflect that in a game, because it may demean that culture or misunderstand it. And so it's being sensitive to the feelings of other cultures, that you're just not going to touch those things. So in a sense, it's much easier sticking to fantasy themes and things that happened a long time ago, because then you're not going to upset anybody. Even then you can upset people. I mean, it's like, I know, if you're doing a game, it's like going back to Struggle of Empires, you're doing any game based in the 18th century, you have to deal with slavery because it was a central part of the period. And as soon as you put slaves in the game, you're asking for a ton of trouble because somebody's going to get annoyed. Whether, and I don't know how you deal with that, because if you don't represent slavery, then you're whitewashing history. And if you do represent it, then somehow it's seen that you are, I don't know, seen as exploiting that or demeaning that. I don't know, but
it feels like, to be able to properly delve into these subjects, it seems to me that we need to get into a situation where games aren't just seen as frivolous things purely for entertainment, but where I know that I had Michael come on to talk about Holding On, which like games where they are meant to make you upset, games where they are meant to feel negative emotions, but possibly provoke some sort of empathy.
Yeah, I mean, I can see there's a place for those games. I suppose that's not, I don't know, that's not, I still feel that most people do want to play games for escapism. And to be, I'm a full-time game designer, so I have to make a living at this. And so generally now, if I'm going to work on a game, I have to feel that it's got the potential to make some money, because, I've got rent to pay, I've got bills to pay, at some point I've got to start saving for my retirement. So picking on themes that might be potentially difficult or put people off, it's like, yeah, you can do it, but for me, it would be an indulgence that I could only do at a point where I was financially settled, where I wasn't worried. The moment, every game, my future money depends on the games I do now. I don't have a Settlers of Catan that keeps bringing in money. I don't have a Ticket to Ride. I don't have that game, although Brass is kind of turning into that, but I don't know how long that's going to last for. And that
I mean, you've got obviously Tinner's Trails coming out, and you've got the Ankh Morpork, which was rethemed and redone as something else. Presumably, there's a bit less work involved in that, and
but they don't make much money. They make a lot of money. I mean, if Tinner's Trail does okay, I'll make a little bit of money, but most board games I do make very little money, which is why now I'm becoming more selective about what I work on. And also with certain things like Bloodstones, doing it myself, with the Monster Rock thing, doing it with Mandy, where I get a greater percentage of the profits, because basically it's a 50-50 split. So I make more money from that. So I know that sounds mercenary, but that's the reality. You can't do stuff for free. You have to make money. This because, but yeah, it's so yeah. There's a lot. Say there's a lot of games I've done in the past, that have just sunk without trace and made a few pennies.
I would ask you what a successful game is for you in terms of like the sales numbers. I know in the past on some shows you said, oh yes, a lot of games, it's like a couple of £1,000, and even if you've got even if you've got 6 of those games, a year, that's not enough to really live any sort of life. You, in another interview, you said, I have no idea what the sales are for Brass. The publishers refused to give me those figures. This isn't, I think this was before Roxley. This was...
Yes, I mean, I'm going to do that. I had to unplug my computer to put the light in, and my computer's saying it's low on battery, so I'm going to have to switch over. So just give me a second.
Sure thing.
Dark for a little bit. Oops.
Oh, and hello, Euron, and just to acknowledge all the chat in the thing, which, according to the chat, everyone agrees that pubs are brilliant, and programming is something that some people are interested in taking on. But anyway.
So yeah, I mean, the original thing, and this goes back to how games used to sell, because when I did Brass originally, back then with the Warfrog games, we'd do 3,000, and if we sold all 3,000, we think we were lucky. You know, we think, yeah, that's great, because that was the size of the market.
Wow.
And so when I did Brass, yeah, I did a deal with Eagle Griffin, and because they were doing the American distribution. And then I asked if they could reprint a couple of thousand. And it was like, yeah, that's fine. And then we had a big falling out over Age of Steam, because they acquired Age of Steam without my permission. And so I just stopped talking to them. All our communication was via lawyers, which is an expensive way of having a conversation. And I completely forgot about Brass, because I thought it was okay. You know, it's all right game, but I had no idea it was going to do that well. So I pretty much ignored it, and I had no idea that they were republishing it without telling me until there's some music. I must do the next time I meet Rick. Because normally when I see Rick, we have a big screaming match and we just shout at each other because he's got a very short fuse. I'm going to get into trouble for saying this. I just hope he doesn't see this, because I'm not meant to talk about him in a derogatory manner, but there we go. But originally, and there's been periods of my time when I've been really stuck for cash. And what I've done in the past is, it's not a good thing to do, but sometimes I've had no choice, where it's like I've had to sell IP outright just for cash. So I've a number of times. And I was really struggling for money. And so I went to Dan Steele at Estedium and said, look, Dan, I need some money. Is there anything you want? And he said, oh, yeah, I think, yeah, so we might be interested in London, and we might be interested in Brass, because Dan's very close to Fantasy Flight, or Christian Peterson. This is going back quite a few years. And so originally I was going to sell Brass to Fantasy Flight for probably a couple of $1,000. And then Rick Surd got wind of it and killed the deal, because he got onto Christian and said, oh, no, I've got the rights to it. And then we went into a legal situation, and then eventually we came to a deal. And in the meantime, I'd been contacted by Roxy, I had never heard of before, and say, look, we really love Brass. If there's any chance we could do Brass, we'd love to do it. And I'm kind of thinking, what, this tiny little company that I've never heard of in Canada doing Brass? I don't think so. But then after all this other stuff happened, I thought, why not? Why not? So yeah, you can do Brass. Best decision I ever made. Absolutely the best decision I've ever made. If it wasn't for Rick killing the deal with Fantasy Flight, I don't know where I'd be now, because basically I've been living off Brass for the last couple of years. I mean, the royalties have been phenomenal, just unbelievable. I mean, the Kickstarter itself made me, I don't know, 100,000 Canadian dollars or something like that. And yeah, it is by far the biggest, it's the most profitable game I've ever done. And it keeps selling. And thank God for that. That is the only game that I've really ever made money off. After all the games I've done, that is the only one that's really made me serious money. And it's bizarre when you think about it. It's like, it's an obscure game about the Industrial Revolution. It's like, what the hell is that about? I mean,
aren't all your games pretty obscure
in the world?
Aren't all your games pretty kind of based on pretty obscure things? Come on.
No, that may be my mistake doing obscure games. But no, I just wanted, you wake up in a cold sweat like, oh my God, what if I'd gone ahead and done that thing? And it's so yeah, I've made lots of mistakes in the past, but fortunately that was one mistake I was stopped from making. And Roxley have been brilliant. I mean, They are such a good company because they pay royalties based on the number of units printed, not sold, and they pay up front. So they're really good. So yeah, I love those guys. Big shout out to Roxley, great guys. So there's a lot of other companies I wouldn't deal with, but yeah, Roxley are one of the companies that because I'm kind of cutting down the number of companies I deal with because it's a pain in the neck dealing with companies.
And for sure, if you didn't like them, you wouldn't go back to them with your big Civ game.
No, absolutely not. No, because if they can do it, if they like it, they do such a good job production-wise. Because and this is the nice thing about them taking on Brass. You know, if Fantasy Flight had have done it, well, it's like, you know, there's no way they would have done the same quality of product, because I kind of think, you know, big companies can do big things, but small games actually require small companies to do that, can invest the time to do things at a higher quality level. Whereas big companies are always thinking, well, how many man hours are we spending on this? Because if we spend too many man hours on it, then we're not going to make enough money on it. So you know, for Fantasy Flight, doing things like, you know, the deck building game, the Keyforge thing, that makes sense, because it makes sense for them to put out a game that's got the potential to sell in 1 million+ units, because that's where it is for them. It makes no sense for them whatsoever to do a game that's going to sell 10,000 units, potentially. It's just not worth getting out of bed for. And that's kind of one of the nice things about the board game industry, in that they're, unlike the video game industry, where it just seems to be a small number of really big boys. In the board game industry, small companies can punch above their weight because they can do things that big companies can't do, or that is economically unviable for big companies to do.
I think there's so much to take away from that. So thank you very much.
Yes.
I think, yeah, congratulations again on Brass, on it being successful. Congratulations on, you know, being so prolific, frankly. I mean, from what I understand, you say that there's games of yours that are still not on Board Game Geek, because I know that there's a small gap of 1 year in 1994 where you, let me double check. There's one of, 1994, according to Board Game Geek, you didn't make anything. Whereas you say that you did actually make something every year.
Yeah, I did. The first year I went to Essen was 94, and I went with Lords of Creation. The following year, I went back with Goblin King and Medieval Empires, which are these really crappy-looking games that I kind of hand-printed. Early on, everything was in white boxes, so it was pretty low-tech. You know, stuff was photocopied and whatnot. But no, I'm pretty sure there was 1 year. No, every year there's always been something, even if it was a winsome game. Back when I used to be friends with John Borer, then there was. It might
just be because Lords of Creation, it's listed as 93, whereas in your mind you went in there in 94. So
the Lords of Creation I originally published it in 93, and then I republished it in 94, and that's the first year I went to Essen.
So
published in 93.
Technically,
and 94.
The catalogue is complete, and it's just that there's. But since then, like, you've been doing an increasing number of games, and then it sounds like you're starting to winnow it down a little bit. But
I'm trying to focus on a smaller range of games, but make them special in some way. I'm basically cutting out those kind of mid-weight Euro games, which are just death. And I'm kind of shying away from lighter games as well, because they're just so difficult to do. They either work or they don't, and they're just, you have to have a really good idea and it works. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it is easier for me now to do the more complex games because you've got more control over them. And I also think, going back to the Kickstarter thing, I think on Kickstarter, people want bling, they want something epic. You know, again, the kind of mid-weight Euro games just don't seem to do well on Kickstarter. So you've got to go with something different, something that's going to grab people's attention in some way.
And
which is it's interesting.
I want to say thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for giving us your time. And
okay.
thank you to everyone in chat. It's been lovely to see everyone. To recap, oh, where's my recap thing? So we talked about Hunt for the Wilder People. We talked about New Zealand and immigration and anti-Semitism and slavery and game inspiration.
Yeah, so this is why I'm not on Twitter. I'd probably get Twitter bombed or something, wouldn't I? Just like
because you just kind of say something and then it's really hard to have context where you're limited to so few characters. Yes, we talked about innovation and horses. I'm getting to there. We talked about game inspirations. Games may not be best for teaching, about your big Civ game you're giving to Roxley, about breeding of horses, playtesting in your head, how much you love New Zealand, but Julia loves the heat, about Kickstarter leading to too many games, some badly developed games, being known for a particular style, so your name doesn't actually sell things, it's just maybe it brings people through the door, about complication in games, about making decisions thematically, it's all about making decisions that fit the narrative, about having those alliances that actually represent the reality, but you saying that, okay, having 3 sides or more sides going on during a game doesn't necessarily make something thematic, how you say diplomacy is not a thematic game. We've not really investigated all your games. You talked about the Rise of Lotus, which you say was rethemed, about Bloodstones being generic fantasy, but the wee trick of, if you make something kind of about wizards, then it's easier to say it's thematic in some ways, how it's almost a crutch. About Monster Rock, doing that reading, about grounding it in reality and internal logic. We talked about Plants versus Zombies. That was basically just me making things intuitive, about people hating reading rules unless, well, Alan's a programmer and hates reading rules. We had some chats in the chat about how some people were wanting rules to be more like flowcharts, which is an interesting idea, but I don't think it would work for most people. But, that's the thing. Everyone learns differently. And looking in the rules breaks immersion. About cards, how they hide so much that it's brilliant because you can surprise people with these things, and how it's expensive then, it's cheaper now, but still it's like adds so much. And I think possibly, I don't know, maybe going without cards allows you to do even more. You talked about not wanting to do themes based on conflicts in living memory, about having to think about the bottom line, having to think about what games have that bigger audience. And that's something I completely resonate with because, since the start of the year, I was kind of starting to move into that position, being like, okay, these games are for my own ego and sort of just something that I want to get made. These games I'm going to make and try to pitch them, but then COVID happened. Anyway, so talked about Brass being successful and becoming an evergreen, but people wanting that blink, wanting something really epic. And so that is that. And is there anything else that you would like to add about the topic of themes or anything else?
No, I think that's probably good for now. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been we've got shout outs to your openness, and
that's what gets me into trouble.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? That's why we talked about Rainer Knizia before the show started, how, Rainer Knizia is on Twitter, but I don't know if it's Rainer Knizia actually typing those things. I mean, Rainer Knizia's English is pretty good, but, maybe someone's there. Like, I've got the Eldec Twitter now. Chris is even typing that for me, where it's like kind of sharing things. And so if you at Eldec Twitter, then you'll basically be chatting to Chris because Chris isn't on Twitter otherwise. Okay. But
I mean, and just to add something, I got my hands slapped by Kosmos last week because I did some interviews on Anno, and I mentioned that because there was a period when developing Anno, there was something right at the end where Ubisoft wanted to change something, and that would have killed the game. And I blew my lid. I just said, look, if you do that, I'm walking away. I just because I had not signed the contract at that point, and I mentioned that in an interview that I got really upset with them, and they backed down and changed their mind, and I got an email from Wolfgang saying, "Yeah, I wish you hadn't mentioned that. We're trying to keep a nice relationship with Ubisoft." And I was like saying, "No, Wolfgang, controversy, it sells." You know, it's like, interesting. But as the Germans are very straight. They're very dull, boring. Oh.
I mean, yeah, it's all sorts of cultures. Like if you went to Japan, then people are even more reserved there.
Yes.
And yeah, apparently you've taken my amateur show to a whole new level, says Jess. I mean, okay. I thought we were friends, Jess. But thank you very much. I want to say, Johan says the German and Dutch can be blunt. And
yes,
Faith claims to be not boring. I do need to wrap up. Where's my little banner? If you want to find me, it is stuffbybeds.com, stuffbybeds.bookcard.com, twitter.com/beds, where I share the most information. Possibly too much, I don't know. Maybe some of it's boring, I don't know. Instagram.com/stuffbybeds. There's some highlights. Twitch.tv/stuffbybeds. I stream every day at 10 a.m. UK time. Facebook.com/thingsbybeds is a thing. And stuffbybeds@gmail.com if you wish to get in touch because you want to offer me work or ask me tips or anything. And we've got your link here, which is wallacedesigns.com.
Yeah, it's not. If you go there, there's nothing there at the moment because we're still working on it, but there will be something there in a couple of weeks' time.
And so that is a thing. I want to say, yes, thank you again, everyone, especially Martin, but also everyone in chat. Now it's quickly over to you. What are you up to? You can share anything you want to. So if you're looking forward to something, if you've got hopes or ambitions, share anything. And for a couple of minutes, we're just going to be an open forum. What are you looking forward to doing over the next day? Martin, I know you're looking forward to going to bed with your other half, presumably.
Yeah, and the other cats. We have 4 cats. One of the cats got into the habit. It's like, I want to sleep on your head, and he does this every night. It's a pain in the ready neck. It's like, oh God. But no, I'm looking forward to. But I'm going into Brisbane on Sunday to do some gaming, so I'm looking forward to that. That will be cool.
So we've got Kiwi Trav, who's starting a Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion campaign tomorrow. People are doing 3D printing or long-term looking forward to your fighting fantasy game.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I didn't mention that, did I? No.
Do you want to give a quick shout out to that?
I mean, I'm doing 2 things for that. I mean, I'm at the risk of extending the thing. One of the payoffs for coming to Australia was, if I'd not come to Australia, I wouldn't have had a certain idea, which was I got invited to a computer company a meeting at a computer company based in Brisbane, who wanted to do a role-playing game. They a simple role-playing game, and I went along to see what this guy had done, and it was awful. It's terrible. But the key concept was really good, which was a 1-deck role-playing game. And so I designed it. So I've got this deck of cards, and it's a whole role-play. It's a whole adventure in a deck of cards, but you can only play it once. And what I'm doing at the moment is adapting it to fighting fantasy so that you can play the fighting fantasy books, do those things as a role-playing game. None of this is official, and none of it's been signed up. But so there'll be that, and then also, I'm still working on the fighting fantasy board game. It's just I've just recently had a whole load of new books because I've not had all of the books yet. So I've just had a friend of mine get them all together, the remaining ones from the UK, and send them over because they're quite expensive over here. So I've got that reading to do. So that will still happen at some point, unless I piss in Livingston off and then he doesn't let me do it. But yeah. You've gone quiet.
Sorry, fingers crossed that won't happen. Jess is doing a bit more teaching, relaxing their mind. People are doing programming on Board Game Arena. Looking forward to running the Expanse RPG, building board game prototypes. Or a friend of Kiwi Trav's is trying to collect every Fantasy Flight book.
Fantasy book, yeah, difficult to do. There's some of them are really rare. Not so much the adventures, but there's some of they did some kind of role playing source books, and they're the things that are really hard to get hold of. But from a design point of view, they're brilliant. They're the goldmine stuff. Luckily, the guy who runs my local games club in Brisbane has a complete collection, all the fighting fantasy stuff. So he loaned me some stuff, and that was really useful.
I am personally looking forward to the Bez and Friends game day, which is just going to be myself and Alan Paul, who I believe you know.
No, Alan, I know Alan well.
And Alan's another old hand at making games, showing off their latest gaming voyages. And we've got Chris Bockley, unpublished designer, but it's a great party game to start off the day. Get everyone joining us, Isaac Shalev, myself, and also Lewis or Emily Shaw showing off Dead and Breakfast. So there will be kind of 5 people showing off 5 games that they helped bring to reality. And so if that's interesting, I will do the intro at 10 a.m. The whole thing, it starts properly at 1 p.m. UK time. For my next streams, look at stuffabez.com/streams. Tomorrow is going to be an absolute delight with Antoinette Mason. We're going to be talking about the nature of a reviewer and what should a reviewer do. What are the obligations of a reviewer, which we've already delved into, but we'll follow up with that. We'll talk about why people review, what is a good review, and all those. There's going to be so much to talk about. Feel free to share, spread the word. If you want, we are going to be raiding Idol Michael if you're in the Twitch. And for now, there is only one thing left to say. The one thing left to say, and people have got so much going on. It sounds amazing, but we have to do it. I hate doing this. I wish this could just carry on for years and years, and we could just move to a commune because you guys are amazing. Yes, I know. We have to say bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, 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 bye. This is the goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.